Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How about a hand for that band that warmed up the crowd here? Yes. Yeah, well, I promise not to dance. I only fall over as a good sailor. But today I'm going to talk about, of course, our next destination, which is the dramatic land of Kamchatka. Now, first of all, when you come here, you have to be able to pronounce it right. Kamchatka. Now, all after me. Kamchatka. Oh, Gesundheit. But in the local Kora language, actually just means our land. And so when the Russian visitors, which they still are, came all the way from the west to find and then settle the little city of Petropovlovsk, they found themselves sort of truly at the end of the world. And so we are going to a place where probably when you go home and you tell people where you were, well, everybody's heard of Japan and Alaska, but Kamchatka is sort of one of the biggest blanks on the map for most people's sense of geography. And above all, it's not Siberia, even though we all want to go there, at least with a round-trip ticket. Kamchatka is its own oblast or province of Russia. And so there's all kinds of other governmental groups in the vastness of Siberia, but Kamchatka has its own unique place as being really the Pacific province of Russia. Of course, there's the further south city of Vladivostok, which is a larger city and a larger naval base. But we are coming here at a time when this town of Petropovlovsk and Kamchatka altogether is open to international visitors. Back in the bad days of the Cold War, this was very much off limits for any visitors. And when I was first here a few years ago, we were very much restricted. If you didn't have a visa, you were not allowed off the ship. You could go into town, but you couldn't walk around. And just this trip, I was told that we could actually get a shuttle bus and wander around town, which is a sign of a little bit more easing of the restrictions of the Russian government to let us visit here, perhaps by the initiative of the local authorities who are trying to make better relations with their neighbors. Well, the neighbors being Japan and Alaska. It's a long way to get anywhere. So if we've come this far, the least they can do is let us walk around town. So I'm going to just show you some of the parts of this vast land that we probably won't get to see too much of. There is that one long excursion out in ATVs up into the mountains, but this province is actually a very big land. It is, of course, right here, this great peninsula, the rest of Siberia, the Sea of Okhotsk, of course, that's Hokkaido. And we've been sailing up along the Kuril stretch. You may have caught a glimpse of those sunny, warm, tropical islands that we've been passing. Well, that's just for looks, that snow. And when we get to Petropovlovsk, of course, it's just at the beginning of the thaw. And this whole area, like Alaska, is pretty much frozen out most of the year. And then it has this lush summertime, and then it's back to the rigors of the cold. Therefore, the Russians who come here have to have a real good reason to come here. I mean, not that it's exactly balmy in the western Russia either, but this was considered almost the worst exile of all was to go to Siberia, but even worse than that was to go to Kamchatka. And actually, there were escapees from the Stalinist labor camps who escaped and then settled illegally in Kamchatka, and who are now free people, I guess, but they're still living in Kamchatka, which is not an easy place to live. So I'll show you a little bit more. Here's the peninsula itself, which stretches, it's 1,100 kilometers, 700 miles. And you see there the other sections of Siberia have their own names, Chukotka, but Kamchatka is just the main peninsula. And in itself, it is larger than Japan. It is larger than California. It's even bigger than Long Island. But it is distinguished by being a great volcanic ridge with 161 volcanoes, 24 of which are active, hundreds of calderas, thousands of hot springs, and lots of rivers, lots of wildlife, deep forest. And so it is perhaps the wildest place we'll ever get to until we get to the next place, which is Alaska. And a lot of it is very similar to Alaska, as you'll see. So we're coming up the coast. Now, this is a warm, sunny day. Notice the palm trees. Well, not really, but we'll get a glimpse of the coast, and then we come up to what's called the Avacha Bay, which is one of the great harbors of the world. And it is a 11-kilometer circular caldera flooded by the sea that makes it a very snug harbor, and that's the reason why the port is there, particularly the Navy installation, especially for the submarine fleet for the North Pacific, is based here in Petropovlovsk. We come into the rocks that stand off the harbor, and then we're out of this roly-poly ocean into a very large, tranquil harbor that's guarded by these big rocks. This is called the Babushka Rock, or the Grandmother Rock. And then there's others called the Three Brothers. Oh, this is the biggest of the brothers. And then others that have quite fantastic formations. Through the later part of the summer season into the winter, this whole area is racked by North Pacific storms, which are very big. They're not really hurricanes or typhoons. They're just generally bad weather stretching for thousands of miles. So this whole coast gets pounded by surf, as does, of course, the coast of Alaska, where we're continuing on. Now, these are the Three Brothers, which they all look like they're had a little bit to drink there, but that's just due to the weather that beats this coast most of the year. Here's their little sister on the shore. And then we enter into this great harbor, and the town of Petropovlovsk was founded by by Cossacks, who were sent to explore the area back in the 1600s, and they established the town of Petropovlovsk in 1696. And then Vitus Bering came on his great Siberian expedition and made his base here for his expedition to go discover North America for Russia at the time. But we'll go into this harbor, and it is one of the most spectacular places to sail into because it's surrounded by volcanoes. And these are the great emblem of Kamchatka, these great cone and rather threatening volcanoes, because a number of them are active and there are regular eruptions here. Pat Abbott can tell you more about the details of the steeper the volcano, the fresher the construction, and it also means that there's still buildup. So this is part of the world where the mountains are still rising. The highest of all of Kamchatka is the Mount Kluyeskoye, which is over 4,800 meters, over 14,200 feet high. But they all overlook the ocean, so this makes it a very spectacular place to visit. Now here's the town itself. It is fairly spread out along the shores of the bay, and originally it was just a little encampment. Now they built a lot of Navy shipyards, repair areas, and outlying neighborhoods, so it's sort of sprawled around this area. There's plenty of room, of course, in this far end of the world. But most of the construction of this town was built during the Soviet era, during the Cold War. But before then, it had been a Navy base under Tsarist times, and then especially the trading post for which the American colonies of Russia came and brought their fur, and that trade was what impelled the Russians to come here and then to go off to Alaska, was for the otter and fur seal trade, which was the furry gold of its era. This is just a Russian tall ship that comes in occasionally. But otherwise, you'll see a bunch of Navy vessels, fishing vessels, and then some local ferry boats, because there's settlements around this vast bay. It does freeze in the winter, so the city sort of closes down and doesn't really move much except by air, of course, in the wintertime. I might note that you see there's an array of shore artillery there that dates from the founding of the city, but it had its only action in 1854 when a combined British and French fleet came and attacked Petropovlovsk, but were driven off by artillery. That was the farthest, let's say, engagement of the Crimean War, was all the way up here. And there are monuments to this era of the explorers, the first settlers, but it's always been a very small population out here. Even today, all of Kamchatka only has 300,000 people in this vast area, of which over half of them live in Petropovlovsk. There are about 10,000 indigenous peoples, also of 4 different groups, the Itilman, the Koryak, the Evan, and the Kochuki, who are on the north side and are more like the Inuit. They are ice hunters. The others are mountain hunters and live in this more boreal area of Kamchatka. So here we are at the landing, and it is in a nice warm summer day, which we have been guaranteed tomorrow, so that it'll be sunny, and everybody suddenly is out sitting in the cafes. And so this is like many a Russian town. It sort of comes to life at this time of year. So this is pictures from a couple of years ago, and they were, at the time, almost falling over itself because they had just opened the town and they were amazed that people would come so far. Well, here we are again. And so now they won't stare at us like we're from another planet, but they are very welcoming. And Petropovlovsk, maybe even more so than, you've been to St. Petersburg, and it's a bit of a grumpy town to visit, often overcrowded, but they don't have that problem here. The town itself, this is its symbol, it's named by Bering after his two ships that he built to go sail across the Pacific, called the St. Peter and St. Paul. So that's why it's Petropovlovsk to this day. And during the Soviet time, it had a more Soviet emblem, but now they've returned to the Tsarist symbol for the city. And you notice the saints, the anchors, and then the volcanoes. They all go together so well. As you go into town, either on tour or on the shuttle, it's sort of, as I say, there are boulevards stretched along the shore and their neighborhoods up into the hills, but it's a very sprawled out city, and it only has a small downtown where I believe the shuttle bus will take us and we can walk around, and there's some shops, but this is not a great urban center by any means. But here are the two ships, the St. Peter and St. Paul. They had recently rebuilt reproduction copies of them that may be in the harbor here, but they built them to recreate the voyage of Bering across to Alaska back a few years ago. So they actually man these 80-foot small barkentine rig vessels and sailed all the way to Alaska and came back. But unlike Bering, they did not freeze to death. But here's the monument to St. Peter and St. Paul, and notice the wedding couple. This is right near the dock. You can see there's a lovely lake and places, but this time of year, as I say, this is when Russia starts to be a happier place. In the downtown, there's some old Soviet-style buildings, government buildings, monuments to particularly the battles of the Crimean War and 1854 again. So this is a very park-like city. This is a monument to Captain Clark, who was the second in command of Captain Cook. And after Cook was killed and eaten in Hawaii, this British officer took command of the vessel, and he came to Petropovlovsk, but he was ill and he died. He's buried here in the city of Petropavlovsk. And they even have one of the last of the statues of Lenin. I don't know if that's still there. It may have been changed to a statue of Putin by now. But I don't know if you're any Russian readers here, but I believe it says, "What a lovely town we have here." There are monuments still from the Soviet times, and then, of course, some of the old style architecture, log cabins, some of the pioneer style architecture in the neighborhood, some rundown dachas, and then there are all the big block modern concrete buildings. This is a picture I found. Was they had rediscovered the burial ground of Bering and a few of his sailors on the Komodorov Islands offshore, where Bering was originally buried, and they exhumed him and they packed his remains, sent it back to Denmark a number of years ago, and this was part of that contingent that did that. But otherwise, if you go back into the neighborhood in Petropavlovsk, it's like going into the grayest and grimmest architecture on earth. And so, this is some kids that grow up here. They wonder why they are living here rather than in a nice, warmer place like Moscow. I think that's what she's thinking. The shopping really is not the feature of this town. There are a couple of handicraft shops of some of the native people's artisan works, embroideries and small carvings, but otherwise this is the end of the world for the goods that people might be looking for. Oh, sorry, there are Gucci bags here, but they're imitations of the fakes. They're not the real fakes. One thing we did last time, we went fishing. It wasn't offered this time, but they take you out in the bay. We go catch what they call blackfish, but they're actually sort of a fluke or a flounder like this. And so this is part of this area is that it's here for recreational purposes. After you get out of these incredible traffic jams where there are up to 3 cars at a time on the road, you get out into the wilderness. Now this is downtown again. This is near the Central Square, a typically ornate Soviet-era building. And in about an hour, you'll see the whole town. And then you'll want to go hiking and meet bears. But you'll see the naval officers here because it's still a major Navy base. And of course, it has its other influences here. I'm surprised they let this stuff in their fine country. But on the outside of town, it starts to get very industrial. Here's one of the shipyards and sort of the remains of the industrial effort out here. But right at the docks where we land, you'll notice that the Russian Coast Guard has a base, and I showed this the other day, that the U.S. Coast Guard is a regular visitor because the Russian and U.S. Coast Guards both conduct joint fishery patrols to keep the international fleet out of territorial waters. And the other beasts in the pond are these. You might see one of these coming and going as we go in and out of the harbor, though the main base is on the other side of the bay, and we're not allowed in to take pictures of these cheerful sailors. Well, anyway, this is not a very, let's say, scenic town like St. Petersburg, but you see in the background these tremendous mountains that loom over the whole city, so it gives it a very distinctive natural setting. And then as you go off into the vastness of Kamchatka, it is one of the wildest places on Earth with very, very few settlements at all. It's mostly a boreal and a tundra climate. They say there's 6 different climatic zones from the far north, which is permafrost, all the way down to the Kuril Islands. This administrative area goes all the way down to the border of Japan, right near Hokkaido. And the forests, though, were very stunted often, and under snow, under heavy winds, under the Siberian frost most of the year. And so it has, the woods are not large, but they're very dense and convoluted, like this bunch of birch trees, or I'm not sure which kind of, I think this is maybe a hemlock, but there's some ancient trees that are very old, but they don't get so big. And I was reading that there's also an area in one of the hot spring valleys that was so warm that during the Ice Age it never froze over, and so there's some ancient primeval fir trees that are in central Kamchatka that were considered holy by the native peoples, and they're there to this day under a nature reserve, but they're the only forest that predates the Ice Age. Well, when you go off in the summertime, you get this kind of low-growth, patchy tundra, a lot of marshlands, a lot of wildlife, some unusual plant life. This is a cotton grass, which, the native indigenous people would collect to weave with. And then there's another kind of a lily that grows in the summer that has a tuber that they would harvest and grind, and that would become their staple, like a bread, and unleavened bread was a traditional meal to get them through the winters here. And in the summertime, like we were going, there's outside of Petropovlovsk, there are dachas and hot springs. Some of you have no doubt signed up for that dacha tour, so bring your bathing suit, because there are warm springs in a lot of them. Here's one that's so hot that his bathing suit got boiled right off of him. So I'll just show you now some of the wildlife here. This is perhaps the symbol of Kamchatka because it's an eagle that exists only on this side of the Pacific. The stellar sea eagle, named after the great German naturalist Georg Steller, who was the scientist who accompanied Vitus Bering on his great expedition. This is the largest eagle on Earth. It's twice the size of a bald eagle, has 3-meter, almost 9-foot wingspan, weighs up to 20 kilograms, so it's very big, and it builds permanent nests where it has 2 chicks a year, and it's sort of like an heir and a spare. There's one that will do well. Often the other one is not as strong and doesn't come back or set out. So, but they're now protected. They used to be hunted like everything else. Now they're all protected. But this is a very spectacular big bird. We may see one if you go outside of town. They don't come into town, of course. But they have a breeding range throughout here, and they also go down in the winter down to Hokkaido in Japan. But there's many nesting pairs all through Kamchatka and the Siberian coast. But they're very distinctive with their snow-capped wings. This is the fisheyes view of the eagle coming to take it to lunch. And there are other sea eagles. This is a crested sea eagle. Sea hawk. This is with that kind of mottled featherings. And there are a lot of other smaller birds. But here's a snow ptarmigan, which you can see is pretty well camouflaged. And then there are puffins on the rocks on the outer islands on the shore. Of course, puffins are common all through the Arctic, and they're sort of a adorable little bird. They're mate for life, and then they have the unusual ability to carry their meal and also dine on it while they're carrying it. Don't try that in the dining room, though. And here's a kind of a woodpecker. What he's actually eating there are salmon roe after a bear had its way with the salmon. The birds come and feed during the salmon runs. And here is one. This is a big Chinook salmon. There is a similar salmon culture here as in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. This is the Pacific Northeast. And so certain comparable species come up the rivers here. Of course, they will always go back to the stream where they were hatched. Remarkable ability of the salmons. We'll hear more about this in Alaska. I'll talk about it specifically. But the salmon run is so important to the ecology because when they come up and they spawn and then they die, they provide nutrition for hundreds of other species and also nurturing the plant life on the banks of the streams with that kind of rich protein that ends up filling up the streams this time of year. A lot of other fish. There's some endemic rainbow trout, pikes, and this makes Kamchatka a great fishing angler's goal, though it could get a little chilly there on your knees. But here's a Russian fisherman with they have gigantic rainbow trout. They're sort of greenish color, some of them. And here's a big pike out of one of the lakes. I don't think we'll have time to go fishing this trip. But if we go for a hike, watch out for these tracks, because you know what that might be. Those are not flip-flops. So the bear population is very large in Kamchatka, and they are brown bears, just like in Alaska, with the improper term of grizzly, because they seem very well groomed if you look at them usually. But they get up to 600 kilograms, that's over 1,200 pounds, however it is, or 1,400 pounds. They'll stand up 300 centimeters, that's almost 10, 11 feet tall, and of course you don't want to meet them when they're hungry. Someone was saying they wanted to go see a bear, and I said, well, you better be careful. They have actually fenced-in areas during the salmon run, so people can go up close and see them, but keep the bears from changing their diet from fish to humans. But these are, they were called by the local Koryak people the brother of humanity, because they're so human-like in some ways. Though I don't know what the bears call us, maybe little brothers for lunch, but they hibernate through the winter, then they come out in the spring with their cubs, and they have a voracious appetite. They'll go, particularly in the salmon run, they'll eat themselves silly. But they are also omnivores. They'll have the berries, and they'll go after other small animals. But look at the nails on this one. See that? He obviously had been to the spa before he went out in public. But now it's rather unfortunate, because this has become a prized capture for the illegal trade to sell to China. And in private and illegal restaurants in China, you can get a bear paw for lunch, though I hear it's a little stringy. And you don't want to meet one this close, because they're very quick and they're very ferocious. And if you ever saw that film, Into the Wild, about the young guy who went to Alaska and he wanted to be friends with the bears, well, the bears are not that friendly, actually. This time of year, they actually are different colors, because they come out from the hibernation in their dens, and then they'll start to shed. So they actually come out and kind of they have their cubs, but the cubs are sort of lighter color. They get that dark color later in the season. And here's a rare albino bear, which may be a apparition to some of the natives. But sometimes you'll see that there's sort of odd colors because of the change in the season in their coat. But here's just some more pictures of their bears at lunch. So again, this is something best seen through a telephoto lens. You don't want to get too close to these guys. Or if you do, you want to sing along with them. Well, I found this picture of a dozing bear. You know, he had had enough at the buffet that he just took a nap in the sun, which of course is that's why bears are cousins, because they do sleep after they have too much to eat. Well, there's a lot of other animals though. Here's a Kamchatka red fox. The Arctic foxes are farther north, but this was a prized catch for the fur trade, along with lynx, sable, wolverine, and these brought incredibly high prices again in China in the trade. Now they're produced, a lot of them produced in farms, so that they're in the wild. They're not as hunted as they used to be. There are also big moose, just like in Alaska, and herds of reindeer. The Intelman native people are reindeer herders, just like the Lapps and others peoples in Siberia. So there are herds of these in the valleys and the upland. There's also a kind of bighorn sheep and mountain goats. So this is a place where it is permitted, this is pretty fantastic big game hunting if you're interested in that. And this is just right along the coast, so they're all over. The great trade that the Russians came for there was for the fur seals, and so they almost completely exterminated the whole lot of them all the way through Alaska. The sea cows, the Steller sea cow, was driven to extinction, but now they're protected and they are back on the rocks, and perhaps even in the bay we'll see some. But they, again, are pretty quick hunters of fish. You look at the teeth in that guy. The fishermen don't like them because they eat too much. But here's another sort of a subarctic spotted seal, which again is on the north coast, the east coast of Kamchatka. But that's a beautiful fur that it has. Sort of like a leopard seal, but it's a different species. Now, somebody asked me, we were looking out if there are any whales in this waters, and they are seasonally. They will go calve in warmer waters in South Asian waters, south of Okinawa, down around Taiwan, Philippines even. But then they come north to feed in the Arctic summer, and so they will be coming up this coast. They'll go through the Aleutian Islands and into the Bering and even all the way to the Arctic. And a few years ago, I was on a ship with Jean-Michel Cousteau, and we were at Unalaska in late September, and all the whales were coming back to the larger Pacific to go to the warmer grounds, to Hawaii, wherever else they go. And we saw more whales than we could count. As far as you could see, they were spouting and coming through the Unalaska Pass, and Cousteau said he was very much encouraged because he had never seen that many whales at one time in his whole life. Of course, they were very much decimated for quite a while in this area by the whaling community, which set up the American Yankee whalers set up a post in Petropovlovsk, which is, again, right here, that little bay. That's a Chaya Bay. And just as a point of history, in 1870, there were so many Americans living in Petropovlovsk that they elected an American mayor. Edmund Sandalin was his name. And the American business interests were so interested in Kamchatka at the time that later, in 1920, they offered to buy Kamchatka from the Russian government. But Lenin refused the deal because he didn't want a capitalist base anywhere near Russia, so he turned it down. Otherwise, Kamchatka might have been the 51st state, but it didn't work out that way. Well, back to nature, though. Here we go on one of the more beautiful cones. This is the Koryazki volcano, about 3,800 meters high. Now, these, again, they're rising. They're erupting, a lot of them, and this whole land is on fire. at different times, but it also is coated in ice, so it makes it very dramatic, especially for mountaineers, volcanologists, geologists. I have a friend, Pat Morrow, if anybody knows of the name, who's the premier Canadian mountain climber. He's got an award for having climbed all the highest peaks on all the continents. But he told me his favorite place on earth to go to climb is in Kamchatka, just because of the drama of these mountains overlooking the sea and the tremendous views you get, but not too close. So I'm not a specialist in this. All I know is that even the picture makes me want to run the other way. So there have been regular eruptions going back to the earliest history of this area, and so this actually becomes a draw now. Ecotourism, people will come to, when there's an eruption, they'll fly into an area and set up a base camp and just watch it, hopefully from a fair distance, because it can get hot. So this is just a few of the peaks. We may see one or two smoking, but the eruptions they're not on our schedule, at least, or read your chronicle if you want to get to see it. But here's one of the peaks overlooking the ocean. There's a whole line of these right as we're going up into Petropovlovsk. So if you're on deck as we sail in, you may see the whole line of them. But this is what gives Kamchatka its great iconic quality, especially to the rest of Russia. I don't know of any other volcanic region in Russia. Perhaps it will happen somewhere. But meanwhile, this area is just full of this geologic activity, and then it can get even more dramatic as it takes on the full explosion. So you can imagine the native peoples trying to live a subsistence existence around this. I mean, it's a pretty hazardous neighborhood if you're not sure which mountain's going to blow up in your face. And when there is an eruption, this is a rare photo by a Russian photographer of static electricity sending lightning down into the eruption. So it's the stuff of geological excitement. And then it also will light up the sky. This is reflections off of the dust clouds that come out of the volcanoes. And then down on the ground comes the lava flows of various kinds, depending on the nature of the lava. It is either viscous or not, and it can either be rocky or else it flows like this, typically of a land-based volcano. It will run in sort of rivers and then make whole valleys into a lava bed, and then slowly plants will colonize it and the weather will wear it down into soil. But even though there's a lot of mineral enrichment in Kamchatka, there's no agriculture that I've ever heard of. Just too cold most of the year. But here's a lava tube. It is solidified, and you can take hikes through them and go into the mountains through the lava tubes. This is a great pumice cliff. So pumice being an aerated lava, so lighter than, so light that it'll float, but there are whole cliffs of this on the edges of former lava flows. And then you add to that all the water running off from the mountains, the ice, the snow melts, so you have tens of thousands of lakes, many which are in caldera. Now, Pat Abbott said the difference between a crater and a caldera is size and also position. So caldera is often the collapsed volcano that then fill with water and become a volcanic lake. Here is a caldera that had another eruption that then made even a larger lake around it. So in the center of Kamchatka, there are very large valleys that are full of thermal hotspots that, again, heat the ground. And there's a whole area called the Valley of the Geysers, which is now a place open to the public. You have to fly into it. But it is sort of like a gigantic Yellowstone Park with mud pits, hot springs, geysers. And you have to watch your step, though. They bubble and they give off fumes. So there's one area where it is so toxic that birds flying over will suddenly die in the air, drop. Animals come down and they suffocate, but there's the gases are so permeant sitting on the bottom of the valley that the animals come down, they die, but they never decompose. They're just sort of become sulfurized. So here's some of the pictures of the mud bubbling baths, and I think they offer this as a treatment at the spa even. but you can get it naturally up in the mountains of Kamchatka. Here's a bear going for his treatment. This is from the Valley of the Geysers. So, like in Yellowstone, other parts of the world, they have a regular cycle of spewing and steaming, and it's builds up calcified domes and things like this. So this is the drama of this land of fire. Here are sulfurous bubbles on a pond. And so this is maybe prettier in a picture than it is in going up, say, because of course the odor is pretty intense, and it's also dangerous to visit there. So some of these natural reserves and parks that they have established, they've built wooden walkways so that you could walk around the area without slipping in. But this is such a big land. How do you get out there? Well, this was the traditional way, and I've been reading the accounts of Bering and Steller trying to get from one side of Kamchatka to the other. It's only about 150 miles over the mountains, but it took them 2 weeks of hauling in sleds and horses, and there were no roads, and actually there still are no roads in most of it. The roads end out of Petropovlovsk pretty quickly. Now they go by horseback as traditionally, or they have four-wheel drive vehicles. This one looks like it's going to the car wash. Or else they have helicopters that'll set up, again, base camps up in the mountains to watch the volcanoes or go hiking and exploring even further in. So you can go buy these Russian helicopters, which I don't believe there's an offering here, but the one thing I never wanted to do was go for a ride in a Russian helicopter. I'd rather walk, but that's the only way to get into many of these places and land and then go further up. So this is where mountaineers and scientists have their field days. So this is on the top of one of the volcanoes, and they had this curious wind cumulus cloud above it. When you're in Petropovlovsk, even if you don't get to go out and see these places, you can get some of the literature and sort of vicariously enjoy the roughness of this great land. Traditionally, the local natives had dog teams, and they had what they call a Kamchatka sled, which is a very lightweight wooden and sinew-made dog sled, so that they could go up, and it was light enough so that they could actually carry it over some of the cliffs and portage their own sled. It's not this whole, and not much of Kamchatka is so flat like much of Alaska. So the natives, I'll leave you with a little view of some of them. There are about 10,000 left, but they've had a very hard time, like many native peoples in North America and all around the world. They were forced into the fur trade by the first Russian settlers. They were all forced to pay a fur tax, and then if they didn't do that, they would be put in jail into hard labor. So a lot of them fled further up into the mountains. There's unfortunate massacres and attacks, particularly the Koryat people on North Kamchatka were very violently resisting the Russians for a long time. Then by the time it came down to the Russian modern era and the Soviet era, they were given moderate autonomy, but they had already been herded into church settlements. The children were made to go to the Orthodox school. They were not allowed to speak their own language, so it's not unlike what happened in other parts of the Americas. But they've had sort of a redress of some of their grievances, and some of them returned to their far villages to try to return to their subsistence living. But now that's led in the current time to what they call ethnographic tourism, where you can go up and stay at one of the Koryat or the Intelman villages, and they'll feed you reindeer meat and local specialties, their own native foods. But then they'll have festivals, and Petropovlovsk every year has a large native days where they have dances and sort of big powwow of these people. But they're not unlike what's happened, of course, in Alaska. And these people have actually joined what's called the Northern Peoples Conference, which is a polar natives non-governmental organization which represents Siberian, Kamchatka people, Alaskans, Inuit, Greenlanders, and so that they have a voice in the United Nations and also to their own national governments to try to have land rights and cultural recognition from their otherwise often repressive national cultures. So here's a Koryat woman, And now this is right out of the tourist brochures of Petropovlovsk, where they do sell these reindeer coats and embroideries and fur trimmings. And so this is the one thing to buy if you want a souvenir of Kamchatka and help the local people. But it's not unlike the Athabascan peoples in Alaska, who do almost exactly the same beadwork. And also they speak almost a mutually intelligible language. So this sort of goes back to even prehistoric times in Beringia, what they call the northern bridge between Asia and North America, where these people would go back and forth. And even though the Bering Strait separates them now, culturally they're very similar on both sides. And now with the ending of the Cold War, now they go and visit each other, and they have had a revival of their traditional culture. And we'll see a bit of it. We're not there for their dance days, but here's a little view of the energetic Koryat people, this particular group. I'm not sure what this guy's trying to say, except maybe he doesn't like vodka. But this is just a pre-taste of what we'll see more of in Alaska, which of course is much more developed in a sense, but perhaps Kamchatka is sort of like Alaska was 50, 100 years ago before the mass tourism came in. So here's one of the games they're doing, moving logs. I'm not sure what the goal of this was, but it looks like a happy time. And then they have a kind of a dance they do with a big reindeer skin. Oh, there he is. Anyway, anybody want to sign up for this? We'll have a special toss just for you. But here's one way to see Kamchatka in midair. And with that, I'm just going to say it's a beautiful place, and we're lucky to be here, and I hope you have a good experience in our brief time in Kamchatka. So thank you very much.